The Ladder of Divine Ascent by John Climacus. Step 4. On Obedience. It is right that our treatise should now deal with the warriors and athletes of Christ. As flower comes before every fruit, so exile of body or will precedes all obedience. On these two virtues, as on two golden wings, the holy soul rises serenely to heaven. Perhaps it was of this the prophet sang when, filled with the Holy Spirit, he said, "Who will give me the wings of a dove? And the active life will give me flight, and I will be at rest in contemplation and lowliness." Psalm 54, verse 7. We ought not omit in this treatise a clear description of the weapons of those noble fighters, the shield of faith which they hold up before God and before their trainer, and with which they ward off, so to speak, all thought of unbelief or backsliding. The spiritual sword that is always drawn and lays low every selfish longing. The iron breastplate of meekness and patience to ward off every insult, every jab and missile. The protective prayer of their spiritual master, which they have as a saving helmet. They do not stand with their feet close together, but one foot is advanced towards service, while the other stays firmly planted in prayer. Obedience is a total renunciation of our own life, and it shows up clearly in the way we act. Or again, obedience is the mortification of the members while the mind remains alive. Obedience is unquestioned movement, death freely accepted, a simple life, danger faced without worry, an unprepared defense before God, fearlessness before death, a safe voyage, a sleeper's journey. Obedience is the burial place of the will and the resurrection of lowliness. A corpse does not contradict or debate the good or whatever seems bad, and the spiritual father who has devoutly put the disciple's soul to death will answer for everything. Indeed, to obey is, with all deliberateness, to put aside the capacity to make one's own judgment. The beginning of the mortification both of the soul's will and also of the body's members is hard. The halfway stage is sometimes difficult, sometimes not, but the end is liberation from the senses and freedom from pain. The blessed living corpse grows sick at heart when he finds himself acting on his own behalf, and he is frightened by the burden of using his own personal judgment. So you have decided to strip for the race of spiritual profession, to take Christ's yoke on your neck, to lay your own burden on the shoulders of another, to pledge your willing surrender to slavery. And for this you want it in writing that you get freedom in return, even when you swim across this great sea borne up on the hands of others? Very well then, but you had better recognize that you have undertaken to travel by a short and rough road, along which there is only one false turning, that which they call self-direction, and if that is avoided, even in matters seemingly good, spiritual, and pleasing to God, then straightway one has reached journey's end. For the fact is that obedience is self-mistrust up to one's dying day in every matter, even the good. When humbly and with true longing for salvation we resolve to bend the neck and entrust ourselves to another in the Lord, there is something to be done before we start. If there happens to be any cunning in us, any prudence, then we should question, examine, and, if I may say so, put to the test our master, so that there is no mistaking the sailor for the helmsman, the patient for the doctor, the passionate for the dispassionate man, the sea for the harbor, with the resulting shipwreck of our soul. But having once entered the stadium of holy living and obedience, we can no longer start criticizing the umpire, even if we should notice some faults in him. After all, he is human, and if we start making judgments, then our submissiveness earns no profit. If we wish to preserve unshaken faith in our superiors, we must write their good deeds indelibly in our hearts and preserve them in our memories, so that when the demons scatter distrust of them among us, we can repel them by what we have retained in our minds. The more faith blossoms in the heart, the more the body is eager to serve. To stumble on distrust is to fall, since whatever does not spring from faith is sin. Romans chapter 14, verse 23. When the thought strikes you to judge or condemn your superior, leap away as though from fornication. Give no trust, place, entry, or starting point to that snake. Say this to the viper: "Listen to me, deceiver. I have no right to pass judgment on my superior, but he has the authority to be my judge. I do not judge him, he judges me." The fathers have declared the singing of psalms to be a weapon, prayer to be a wall, and honest tears to be a bath. To them, blessed obedience is confession of faith, without which no one subject to passions will see the Lord. He who is submissive is passing sentence on himself. If his obedience for the Lord's sake is perfect, even when it does not appear to be so, he will escape judgment. But if in some things he follows his own will, then even though he thinks of himself as obedient, he takes the burden onto his own self. If the superior continues to rebuke him, then that is good. But if he gives up, I do not know what to say. Those who submit to the Lord with simple heart will run the good race. If they keep their minds on a leash, they will not draw the wickedness of demons onto themselves. Above all, let us make our confession to our good judge, and to him alone, though to all if he so commands. Wounds shown in public will not grow worse, but will be healed. In a monastery I once saw a judgment that was truly terrible. It was made by a superior who was good as a man and as a shepherd, and it happened while I was staying there. A robber sought admission to the monastic life, and that excellent superior, that man of healing, ordered him to take 7 days of complete rest, so that he might get to know the kind of life in the place. After a week, the superior sent for him and asked him privately if he would like to live there among them. When the other man showed genuine enthusiasm for this, he asked him what wrong he had done in the world, and on observing the ready admission of everything, he tested him further. "I want you to tell this to the brethren," he said. Since the other man had really come to hate his wrongdoing and was not troubled by shame, he promptly agreed. "I will confess in the middle of Alexandria itself, if you wish," he said. And so the superior gathered his flock into the church. There were 230 of them, and when the holy service was in progress and the gospel had been read, for it was Sunday, this irreproachable convict was led out by some of the brethren, who hit him but lightly. He had his hands tied behind his back, He was wearing a hair shirt, and ashes had been sprinkled on his head. Everyone was amazed, and there were some shouts, for it was not clear what was happening. But when the robber appeared at the doors of the church, that very charitable superior said loudly to him, "Stop, you are not worthy to come in here." The robber was astounded by the voice of the superior coming from the sanctuary. He swore afterwards that he thought he heard thunder and not a human voice. At once he fell on his face, and he trembled and shook with fear. While he lay on the ground, moisturing the floor with his tears, the marvelous healer turned to him, trying everything so as to save him and to give everyone else an example of salvation and true humility. Before all, he exhorted him to describe in detail everything he had done. Terrified, the robber confessed all sins of the flesh, natural and unnatural, with humans and with beasts, poisonings, murders, and many other deeds too awful to hear or to set down on paper. Everyone was horrified, but when he had finished his confession, the superior allowed him to be given the habit at once and to be included in the ranks of the brethren. I was amazed by the wisdom of that holy man, and when we were alone, I asked him why he had contrived such an extraordinary spectacle. For 2 reasons, this true healer replied. First, so that this man, having confessed now in shame, might in the future be spared fresh remorse for these deeds, which is what happened. He did not rise up from the floor, Brother John, until he had been granted forgiveness of all his sins. Have no doubt about this. Indeed, one of the brethren who was present told me he saw a terrifying figure holding a book and a pen and crossing off each sin as it was confessed. Now this is quite probable if you bear in mind the words, "I shall confess my wrongdoing to the Lord, and you have taken away the wickedness of my heart." Psalm 31, verse 5. But there was a second reason. There are some among the brethren who have not confessed their sins, and I want to encourage them to make their confession, for without this no one will be pardoned. I saw many other wonders and marvels in the company of that unforgettable pastor and his flock, and I will try to tell you a great deal about them. For I stayed quite a while with these men, studying their way of life and being constantly amazed at how these men of earth succeeded in imitating heavenly beings. An unbreakable bond of love joined these men together, and more wonderful was their freedom from all familiarity and idle chatter. Above all, they strove never to injure a brother's conscience, and if ever someone showed hatred of another, the shepherd banished him like a convict to the isolation monastery. Once, when a brother spoke ill of a neighbor, the holy man, on hearing him, had him expelled immediately. "I am not having a visible devil here along with the invisible one," he said. Among these holy fathers, I saw things that were really profitable and worthy of admiration. I saw a fraternity assembled and united in the Lord, and with a wonderful combination of action and contemplation. They were so taken up with the things of heaven, and they practiced so much good, that they had little need of the promptings of the superior, and it was out of their own good will that they stirred each to divine vigilance. They had certain holy and divine exercises that were laid down, studied, and established. If the superior was away and the brother began to resort to abusive language, criticism of others, or merely idle chatter, a discreet nod from another pulled him up short and quietly stopped him. If it happened that the brother did not notice, then the one who reminded him would prostrate himself before him and then go away. If they had to speak, what they talked about all the time was the remembrance of death and the thought of everlasting judgment. I must tell you about the astonishing achievement of the baker they had there. Noticing that during his work he preserved a totally recollected state and a capacity for tears, I asked him how he had managed to be granted such a grace. He answered me when I became insistent, "It always seems to me that I serve God and not man," he said, "and so I judge myself to be undeserving of any rest. And this fire here reminds me of the everlasting fire to come." There is another achievement of theirs about which we should hear. Even in the refectory they did not cease from mental prayer, and by secret signs and gestures these holy men reminded each other of it. And they did this not only in the refectory, but everywhere they met or assembled. If one of them committed a fault, many of the brothers would seek his permission to take the matter to the shepherd and to accept both the responsibility and the punishment. When the great man found out that his disciples did this, he inflicted easier punishments in the knowledge that the one punished was actually innocent, and he made no effort to discover the real culprit. And what of idle talk and levity? Or if one of them started a row with a neighbor, a third who happened to pass by would undertake penance for it, and thus dissolve the anger. If he noticed that bad feeling somehow persisted among the disputants, he would report the matter to the father who was next to the superior, and he would prepare for a reconciliation to be made before sundown. But if they persisted in their hard feelings, they would get no food until they had resolved their difference, or else they were driven from the monastery. Praiseworthy sternness of this kind has reached a high point among them and bears plenty of fruit. Many of these holy fathers became experts in active life and in spirituality, in discernment and humility. Among them was the awful and yet angelic sight of men, gray-haired, venerable, preeminent in holiness, still going about like obedient children and taking the greatest delight in their lowliness. I have seen men there who lived in total obedience for all of 50 years, and when I begged them to tell me what consolation they had won from so great a labor, some answered that having arrived thereby at the lowest depths of abasement, they could repel every onslaught, while others declared that they had attained complete freedom from the senses and had obtained serenity amid every calumny and insult. I saw others among these wonderful fathers who had the white hair of angels, the deepest innocence, and a wise simplicity that was spontaneous and yet directed by God Himself. The fact is that just as an evil person is two-faced, one thing in public and another in private, so a simple person is not twofold, but something whole. There is no one among them who is silly and foolish in the way that some old men in the world are, as they say, senile. No, indeed. They are openly gentle, kindly, radiant, genuine, without hypocrisy, affection, or falsity of either speech or disposition, something not found in many. Spiritually, they are like children, with God and the superior as their very breath, and with the mind's eye on strict lookout for demons and the passions. Holy Father and brothers in God, a lifetime would not be enough to allow me to describe the virtue of those blessed men or the heavenly life they lead. Still, their great struggles, rather than my meager suggestions, should adorn this treatise and should rouse you to be zealous in the love of God. After all, the lowly is adorned by the excellent, and I would only ask you to refrain from thinking that what I write is something made up, for a suspicion of this kind would only take away from its value. So then, let us resume. In this monastery to which I have been referring, there was a man named Isidore from Alexandria, who, having belonged to the ruling class, had become a monk. I met him there. The most holy shepherd, after having let him join, discovered that he was a troublemaker, cruel, sly, and haughty, but he shrewdly managed to outwit the cunning of the devils in him. If you have decided to accept the yoke of Christ, he told Isidore, I want you first of all to learn obedience. Most Holy Father, I submit to you like iron to the blacksmith. Isidore replied. The superior, availing of this metaphor, immediately gave exercise to the iron Isidore and said to him, Brother, this is what I want you to do. You are to stand at the gate of the monastery, and before everyone passing in or out, you are to bend the knee and say, Pray for me, Father, because I am an epileptic. And Isidore obeyed, like an angel obeying the Lord. He spent 7 years at the gate and achieved deep humility and compunction. After the statutory 7 years, and after the wonderful steadfastness of the man, the superior deemed him fully worthy to be admitted to the ranks of the brethren and wanted to ordain him. Through others, and also through my feeble intercession, Isidore begged the superior many times to let him finish his course. He hinted that his death, his call, was near, which in fact proved to be so. The superior allowed him to stay at his place, and 10 days later, humbly, gloriously, he passed on to the Lord. A week after his death, the porter of the monastery was also taken, for the blessed Isidore had said to him, If I have found favor in the sight of the Lord, you too will be inseparably joined to me within a short time. That is exactly what happened, in testimony to his unashamed obedience and his marvelous humility. While he was still alive, I asked this great Isidore how he had occupied his mind while he was at the gate, and this memorable man did not conceal anything from me, for he wished to be of help. At first I judged that I had been sold into slavery for my sins, he said, so I did penance with bitterness, great effort, and blood. After a year, my heart was no longer full of grief, and I began to think of a reward for my obedience from God Himself. Another year passed, and in the depths of my heart, I began to see how unworthy I was to live in a monastery, to encounter the Fathers, to share in the divine mysteries. I lost the courage to look anyone in the face, but lowering my eyes and lowering my thoughts even further, I asked with true sincerity for the prayers of those going in and out. Once, when I was sitting in the refectory with the superior, he asked me in a whisper if I would like to see holy prudence in someone very old. When I said I wished that very much, he summoned from the second table a man called Laurence, who had been about 48 years in the monastery, and was second priest in the monastery. He came, genuflected before the abbot, and received his blessing. When he stood up, the abbot said nothing at all to him, but left him standing beside the table and not eating. It was just the start of the midday meal, so that he was left standing there a full hour, probably two. I was embarrassed to look this hard-working man in the face, for he was completely white-haired and all of 80 years. He stayed there until we had finished eating, and when we got up, the holy man sent him off to the great Isidore to recite to him the beginning of the 39th Psalm. Being myself a bad character, I did not let slip the chance to tease the old man, so I asked him what he had been thinking about as he stood by the table. I thought of the shepherd as the image of Christ. He said, I thought of the command as coming not from him, but from God. And so, Father John, I stood praying as if I were in front of the altar of God rather than the table of man. And because I trust and love my shepherd, I had no malevolent thoughts concerning him. It is said that love does not reckon up injury. But be sure of this much, Father, that anyone who freely chooses to be simple and guileless provides the devil with neither the time nor the place for an attack. And the just Lord sent that shepherd of the holy flock, someone just like himself, to be the bursar of the monastery. He was modest, like few others, and gentle, as very few are. As a help to the others, the great elder once pretended to get angry with him in the church and ordered him out before the usual time. Now I knew that he was innocent of the charge laid against him by the pastor, and when we were alone, I started to plead with the great man on behalf of the bursar. But this is what the wise man said, Father, I too know he is innocent, but just as it would be a pity and indeed quite wrong to snatch bread from the mouth of a starving child, so too the director of souls does harm to himself and to the ascetic if he denies him frequent opportunities to gain crowns such as the superior thinks he deserves at each hour, through having to put up with insults, dishonor, contempt, and mockery. Three things happen that are very wrong. First, the director misses the rewards due to him for making corrections. Second, the director fails to bring profit to others when he could have done so through the virtue of that one person. But third and worst is that those who seem to be the most hard-working and obedient and hence confirmed in virtue, if left for any length of time without being censored or reproached by the superior, lose that meekness and obedience they formerly had. Good, fruitful, and fertile land, if left without the water of dishonor, can revert to being forest and can produce the thorns of vanity, cowardice, and arrogance. The great apostle understood this. Hence his instruction to Timothy, be insistent, criticize them, rebuke in season and out of season. 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 2. But when I argued the matter with that true director, reminding him of human frailty, I suggested that punishment, deserved or otherwise, might lead many to break away from the flock. That man, in whom wisdom had made a home, had this to say to me, A soul bound in faith and love to the shepherd for Christ's sake does not go away, even when blood is spilled. He certainly does not live if, through the shepherd, he has received the cure for his wounds, for he bears in mind the words, "Neither angels, nor principalities, nor powers, nor any other creature can separate us from the love of Christ." Romans chapter 8, verses 38-39. If a soul is not attached, bound, and devoted to the shepherd in this fashion, it seems to me that the man should not be here at all. For what binds him to the shepherd is hypocrisy and false obedience. And the truth is that this great man is not deceived, for he has guided, led to perfection, and offered to Christ blameless sacrifices. Let us listen to the wisdom of God found in earthen vessels and marvel at it. While I was there, I was astonished by the faith and the patience of the novices. With unshakable courage, they accepted the criticism of the superior, and indeed of those far below him in rank. For my own edification, I put questions to one of the brothers, called Abbacyrus, who had lived 15 years in the monastery, and who, as I saw, was badly treated by nearly everyone. Those serving at table drove him out almost daily for being naturally unrestrained in his talk. "Brother Abbacyrus," I asked, "why do I see you thrown out of the refectory every day and going without supper to bed?" "Father," he answered, "you may be sure that they are testing me to find out if I would ever make a monk. They do not really mean to be harsh. I know what the superior and they are trying to do, and so I put up with all this and do not become burdened by it. I have done it now for 15 years. At the time I came into the monastery, they told me that those who renounce the world are tested for 30 years. And they are right, Father John, for gold is not purified unless it has been tested." This fine man Abbacyrus lived for 2 more years after my arrival at the monastery. Just before he passed on to the Lord, he said this to the fathers: "I thank the Lord and I thank you. For my own salvation you put me to the test, and for 17 years now I have lived without being tempted by devils." And the just superior gave orders that he had earned the right to be buried as a confessor with the local saints. Now I would do wrong to all those eager for perfection if I were to bury in the tomb of silence the achievement and the reward of Macedonius, the first of their deacons, a man zealous for God. On one occasion, just 2 days before the feast of the Holy Theophany, he asked the superior for permission to go to Alexandria for a certain personal matter. He promised to get back from the city in time for the preparation for the feast. The devil, however, who loathes everything good, contrived to put an obstacle in the way of the archdeacon, who, although permitted to leave the monastery, did not return for the holy feast at the time set by the superior. He came back a day late, was deposed from the diaconate by the pastor, and was put in the rank of the lowest novices. This good deacon of obedience, this archdeacon of patience, accepted the decision of the father as calmly as though the punishment had been meted out to someone else. After 40 days in that state, he was restored to his previous rank by the pastor. But scarcely a day later, the archdeacon begged to be put back to his former condition of discipline and dishonor, saying, "I committed an unforgivable sin while I was in the city, This was untrue, and the Holy Superior knew it. The ascetic was looking for punishment for the sake of humility, and his wish was granted. Then came the spectacle of a white-haired elder passing his days as a novice and sincerely begging everyone to pray for him. "I fell into the fornication of disobedience," he said, but secretly this great Macedonius explained to me, lowly that I am, why he had voluntarily adopted a humbled life of this kind. I have never felt such absence of conflict within me, such sweetness of divine light as now, he said. It is said of angels that they do not, or, as some would have it, that they cannot fall. But men fall, yet they can quickly rise again as often as this may happen to them. Devils, and devils only, never rise once they have fallen. There was a brother there, the bursar of the monastery, who had this to say to me in confidence. When I was young and had charge of the animals, I had a very bad spiritual failure. But since it was never my custom to conceal a snake in the hiding place of my heart, I grabbed it forthwith by the tail, meaning that I ended the matter, and I revealed it at once to the healer. He gave me a light blow on the chin, smiled, and said to me, "All right, child, go back to your job, and do not be in the slightest way afraid." With heart of fire I did as I was told, and within a few days I knew I was cured, and so, with a mixture of joy and fear, I carried on. They say that every creature has differences that mark it off from others. That is how it was in the assembly of the brothers, where differences of success and disposition were to be found. If the healer observed some showing off before visitors to the monastery from the outside world, he used to heap the worst insults on them in the presence of the visitors, and used to send them off on the most humiliating jobs, with the result that they would hastily retreat, and the arrival of the secular visitors would turn out to be an opportunity for self-mastery. Thus, there was to be seen the extraordinary spectacle of vanity chasing herself out of sight. The Lord did not want to deprive me of the prayer of one of the holy fathers in the monastery, and so a week before I left, he took to himself a marvelous man called Menas, the second priest of the monastery, a man who for 49 years had lived in the community and had served in every office. 3 days after the death of this saintly monk, when we had finished with the customary rites, the place where he lay was suddenly filled with a great fragrance. We were allowed by the superior to open the coffin in which he lay, and when this was done, we had sight of what seemed like 2 streams of myrrh flowing from his venerable feet. The teacher said to all of us, "Look, the sweat of his labors has been offered up as myrrh to God and has been truly accepted." The fathers of that place described many of the triumphs of this holy saint Menas. Among them were what follows. On one occasion, the superior wanted to test his God-given patience. Coming in the evening to the abbot's cell, he prostrated himself and, in the customary fashion, he asked for his instructions. However, the abbot left him on the ground until the time came for the office, and only then did he give him his blessing. But the holy man, knowing his heroic endurance, criticized him for self-display and impatience. He did it for the edification of everyone. This story was confirmed by a disciple of the holy Menas. I wanted to find out if he had fallen asleep while he was prostrate on the ground before the holy abbot. But he assured me that he had recited the entire Psalter while lying down. There is an emerald to adorn the crown of this discourse, and I must not forget to tell of it, for on one occasion I initiated a discussion of stillness among the most experienced elders there. They smiled, and in their own cheerful way they spoke to me courteously as follows: "Father John, we are corporeal beings, and we lead a corporeal life. Knowing this, we choose to wage war according to the measure of our weakness, and we think it better to struggle with men who sometimes rage and are sometimes contrite than to do battle with demons who are always in a rage and always carrying arms against us." One of those memorable men showed me great love according to God. He was outspoken, and once, in his own kindly fashion, he said this to me: "Wise man, if you have consciously within you the power of him who said, 'I can do everything in Christ who strengthens me,' Philippians chapter 4, verse 13, if the Holy Spirit has come upon you as on the Holy Virgin with the dew of purity, if the power of the Most High has cast the shadow of patience over you, then, like Christ our God, gird your loins with the towel of obedience, rise from the supper of stillness, wash the feet of your brethren in a spirit of contrition, and roll yourself under the feet of the brethren with humbled will. Place strict and unsleeping guards at the gateway of your heart. Practice inward stillness amid the twistings and the turbulence of your limbs. And, strangest of all perhaps, keep your soul undisturbed while tumult rages about you. Your tongue longs to jump into argument, but restrain it. It is a tyrant, and you must fight it daily 70 times 7. Fix your mind to your soul as to the wood of a cross. Strike it with alternating hammer blows like an anvil. It has to be mocked, abused, ridiculed, and wronged, though without in any way being crushed or broken. Indeed, it must keep calm and unstirred. Shed your will as if it were some disgraceful garment, and having thus stripped yourself of it, go into the practice arena. Put on the breastplate of faith, which is so hard to come by, and let it not be crushed or damaged by distrust of your trainer. Let the rein of temperance carve the shameless onward leap of the sense of touch. With meditation on death, bridle those eyes so ready to waste endless hours in the contemplation of physical beauty. Hold back your mind, so busy with its own concerns, so ready to turn to the reckless criticism and condemnation of your brother. Show instead every love and sympathy for your neighbor. Dearest Father, all men will come to know that we are disciples of Christ if, as we live together, we have love for one another. Stay here with us, my friend, stay. Drink down ridicule by the hour as if it were living water. David tried every pleasure under the sun, and at the end was at a loss, saying, "Behold, what is good, or what is pleasant." Psalm 132, verse 1. And there was nothing except that brothers should live together in unity. But if this blessing of patience and obedience has still not been given to us, then the best thing to do is, having discovered our weakness, to stay away from the athlete's stadium, to bless the contestants, and to pray that it might be granted to them to endure. Such was the discourse of this good father and excellent teacher, who argued with me in an evangelical and prophetic way, like a friend, and I was persuaded, so that with no hesitation I agreed to give first place to blessed obedience. When I have noted down a further profitable virtue of these blessed fathers, one that is surely from paradise, I will come back to my own unlovely and useless briar patch. The blessed pastor noticed that some continued to talk while the rest of us were standing at prayer. He made them stand in front of the church for a whole week, and they had to make a prostration before everyone going in or out. And, what was even more surprising, he did it to people of clerical rank, that is, to priests. I noticed one brother during the singing of the psalms. He showed more feeling than many of the others, and his movements and expressions were such as to make it look as though he were carrying on a conversation with someone. This was particularly so at the beginning of the hymns. I asked the holy man to explain this to me, and because he knew it was to my advantage that he should not be reticent about it, he said this to me: "Father John, it is my custom at the very start to gather my thoughts, my mind, and my soul. I call to them and cry out, 'Come, let us worship and fall down before Christ, our King and God.'" Psalm 94, verse 6.